Real pleasure to welcome to the High Performance Podcast, Chrissie Wellington. Welcome along.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Chrissie, what is high performance?
To me, high performance is not a noun. It's a way of acting and a way of being. And if I were to answer that question succinctly, I think it would be to bring your best self to every moment, be willing to learn and to act with self-integrity.
Very nice. So you came to the world of elite sport quite late, 30 years old, when you had a big change and decided to go professional and compete. So was that kind of high performance mindset something that you'd already had for many years before that? Or was it the world of sport that helped you create it?
I've always been a very driven, determined person. I've always been incredibly curious about myself, my potential, and I've also been incredibly curious about the world around me. And initially, I channeled all of that into my academic studies. So I really wanted to excel academically, achieve the highest grades possible, and go to university. And I was also driven by this compulsion to see how good I could be. So I think I've always had that insatiable desire to explore my own potential. But it, like you said, it wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s that I channeled that into the sporting context. Prior to that, it was largely academia.
So where does that come from then, Chrissie, that desire to want to excel?
It's always something that's been really, really instinctive. And I don't know where it's come from. I don't think it's ever been the result of an external pressure. I think it's always been an internal compulsion and something that I've always felt very, very strongly. I don't recall ever having that external pressure from my parents, for example, to perform academically. It was also always something that was very much driven from within, and that the desire to have an answer to the question of how good can you be. It's always driven me, because I've never, ever wanted to look back and think, what if? So I've always been prepared to try and to explore and to pivot in my life, because maybe I've been compelled by the fear of not knowing. For me, the fear of not knowing how good I can be is worse than the fear of the unknown that you might, leap into.
So here's something that I think a lot of our listeners often struggle with, which is knowing how to find their limit, knowing when they have reached their absolute peak. How did you come to work out, right, that's my limit, that's as good as I can be? How did you judge yourself?
For me, in the sporting context, it was always an iterative process. I would definitely not claim to be the most confident person. I certainly wasn't imbued with this strong sense of self-belief, but like I said, I was imbued with this willingness to try and to explore. So for me, building confidence, building self-belief was very much an iterative process. And it's when you do that you realize that you can shift the needle a little bit for yourself. You can raise the bar, you can test your limits. You realize they weren't where you thought they were, and you raise them again. So for me, sport was about testing my limits and realizing I was capable of so much more than I ever thought. But I didn't do that independently of the world around me. I was privileged and blessed to be surrounded by so many people, and some of whom could see me when I couldn't see myself. And I often wonder, and maybe Damien, you have an answer to this, how does someone become world champion without ever having that as a goal, at least at the outset? So I became world champion without ever aspiring to, at least initially. And I believe it's that process of curiosity and that willingness to put one foot in front of the other, to test yourself, to move yourself forward, and to very much invest in the process without having the clarity of the goal, but then also being surrounded by people, like I said, that can see your talent and your skills when you can't even see them for yourself, and maybe create a plan for you that you execute without ever knowing what the intended outcome is.
I find it fascinating in terms of how you describe that process that you did it, because what equally fascinates me, Chrissie, is the curiosity that you adopted, say, outside of sport, when you travelled and you took 2 years off from before you went to university. Is that right, to travel?
I went to university. I went to the University of Birmingham, and I did geography. And I graduated having achieved my, the grades that I'd aspired to. And I knew that I needed a vocation. I was desperate for a vocation. In retrospect, I was desperate for validation. I was desperate for a label. I was doing something because I felt I ought to. And I chose to go into law. And it appealed to some of, the skills and qualities and traits that I had. And I signed for a law firm in London, but knew I wanted to take a gap year. So they agreed that I could do a gap year. And it was when I was traveling, I started traveling in Africa. And it was there that for the very first time, I think I realized firsthand the beauty of the world around me. But I also saw abject poverty and deprivation. And it was that ignited something in me, this childhood passion for driving positive change, ignited this passion in me. And it was there in Africa that I felt the spark of this purpose, this life purpose. And so instead of going back to do law, I carried on traveling. So what should have been 9 months traveling became 2 years. And then I came back and did my MA in development economics and international development up in Manchester. And I think for me, that was the first time I ever stepped off the path. I realized at that point I'd been performing and conforming at life, doing what was expected of me as someone who was, academically strong, but it wasn't in line with my inner purpose. And so I pivoted, I stepped off the path, and I came to my first career, which was international development.
See, what's interesting is when you say that was the first time you'd stepped off the path, that where you were travelling, though, was off the beaten path in many ways, wasn't it? You weren't doing a gap year up the coast in Australia or where lots of your peers would have been. You would go into parts of the world that were almost, that required you to be brave and go off-piste a little bit. It was
stepping off the path. I think whenever you take what some would perceive as a risk, it's often a managed risk. You manage some of the problems that you perceive you might encounter. But for me, I've always felt incredibly supported by my environment to explore. So my parents have always supported my insatiable kind of curiosity to explore, whether it's explore different activities and explore different places. And I certainly didn't grow up in a wealthy environment, but they gave me every opportunity that they could. But I've always had, ever since I was very young, this appetite to understand the world around me and to experience it. A child of the 80s, grew up with images of the Ethiopian famine, and it gripped the public consciousness. And I was 7, I guess, at the time. And I was really, really impacted by that, and I had this desire to understand and explore the world, even back then. So I think me journeying and me traveling was part of that desire to seek some answers to the questions and to find out about a world beyond my own borders.
What I find interesting is that obviously you're someone that wanted to explore, and you wanted to explore your own physical ability as well as explore the world around you and understand things. But that isn't enough to make you a world champion, just wanting to explore. So where did the high performance, constant, I mean, I can't even imagine the pain that you put yourself through trying to train to do an Ironman triathlon. Where did that side of you come from, do you think?
I was open to the possibility of trying new things. And I think sometimes we close ourselves off from the unknown because we're scared. It's easy to sit in your comfort zone, and it's harder to step out of it. And when someone suggested I try a triathlon, instead of saying, well, I did say this, I've never ridden a road bike, but I, was still open to the idea, but I'd never ridden a road bike. I was open to that possibility. And that was preceded by me kind of segueing into running at a very, very amateur level and kind of cutting my teeth in endurance sports through
you've done
running.
a marathon, is that right?
I did the London Marathon. I was inspired by a friend. She'd grown up with a heart defect and had run the London Marathon. And I looked at her and I looked at me with my fully functional heart, and I'm like, what is stopping me? Why? And we're all inspired by people around us, right? And she was my role model and my inspiration. And so I trained in a very unknowledgeable and unstructured way for the London Marathon. But again, I tested my limits and realized I was capable of so much more than I thought. And the same with triathlon. So I was open to the possibility of doing a triathlon. I had an environment around me in that I joined a triathlon club. So they facilitated that. They lent me equipment, all of the things you need. And I think, long story very short, I was able to tap into a talent, a physiological talent that I didn't know I had. So I think I had that physiological aptitude for endurance sports that, had I never done them, I never would have known, and it would have laid dormant. But I don't need to tell you, it's not enough to be physically talented. And I think all of the traits that I mentioned before, that the drive, the determination, the willingness to be curious, this inner competitiveness and out competitive with others, all of those traits that I channeled into academia, I then brought to bear in professional sport. But I really had to hone the psychological side of things, I think, in order to achieve success. And that's where I give credit to the people around me, because they enabled me to get a handle on the psychological side, which enabled me to become a high-performing athlete that was capable of executing consistently and achieving more than I ever thought I was capable of.
Which is something that I'd like to explore, but I think there's a psychological trait that you've brushed over this, Chrissie, that intrigues me. Is you've spoken about this being openness to it, but there was incidents that happened in your life, like you crashed, you had a bike accident, didn't you? And that was what precipitated you then trying triathlon. Is that right?
That's true. I've had many bike accidents, Damien,
right,
in my life. I'm technically incompetent on the bike, which is largely why I chose Ironman, because I don't have to ride in a pack. I can just ride on my own 10 metres in front or 10 metres behind someone else. But yes, I was training for the London Marathon. I was just commuting. I lived in London. I was commuting on my bike. and I came off the bike, couldn't run the London Marathon. So thought, right, instead of running, I'll try swimming. I'd grown up swimming from my local club. So I started swimming again. So that's where I gained,
But it was the ability to pivot and see an accident like that, rather than stopping you doing what you wanted. It just merely opened up another door to explore.
I try not to let problems or adversity or setbacks derail me, because I see it as part and parcel of the journey. And that's easy in retrospect, but if I look back at my life, some of many of the opportunities that I've had have come from when I have pivoted and I've done something different, or I've encountered a setback or discomfort or adversity, because there've been the opportunities to grow in an area that I may ever not have envisaged.
So could you share some of the tools that you learned for how to deal with adversity? Because that, even people that listen to this who've got great plans, it can often be the adversity that derails them and they can't get back on track.
No matter who we are, we encounter adversity. If we look what we've all been through in the past year, we've all had to adapt and change and cope with things that we may not have imagined. And people are coping with a loss of career or, unfortunately, death of loved ones. And we're all having to cope with adversity. If I look to sport and I look to the race that I did, I see it as a microcosm of life, and an endurance sport. It's very easy to do that because it's long and you've got highs and you've got lows. So if I think to how I coped with the lows, how I coped with the pain, the discomfort, the self-doubt, the questioning, I think first and foremost, I expected it and I embraced it. So I don't go into my life, I don't go into a race not expecting everything to go perfectly.
Why is it important to expect it?
Because then you don't panic. You're not anxious when it doesn't go according to some kind of utopian plan that you have. So if I go into a race thinking it's going to go like this, and this, and this, and then I'll cross the finish line victorious, it's just not going to happen. Because that's not racing. The beauty of racing is precisely because it doesn't go according to plan. It's because you have to hurt. It's because you have to suffer. And I see that as part of racing. That's what I loved about racing. The unexpected, the discomfort, the self-doubt. It's the challenge of having to deal with that I loved. So I expected it and I embraced it, first of all. I always tried to segment the race into portions, and I think that's really important. So if we face adversity, a mountain to climb, that old analogy, it can be incomprehensible. But if we, like I did in an Ironman, just segment it into 200 meters in the swim, then I've got to get to that buoy, then I've got to get onto the bike, then I've got to do this 40k. I just segment it down, and I very much try and stay in the moment, and like we said at the outset, bringing your best self to that moment. I try and disassociate, so I take myself off to a place that's a bit more pleasurable. So I have a bank of really positive images or songs or poems or mantras. Rudyard Kipling's If. I still carry this dogged copy around with me.
Would you use those in the heat of battle?
Yes.
So what, would you just recite the poem?
It's even written on my water bottles, Jake. So prior to the race, we all have this plan, and part of my preparation was to write Rudyard Kipling's If on my water bottles. And the one I had before I went into the swim. It was a meditative process for me, and I could internalize the words. And there's also a bit of superstition, because once you do it once and you've won a race, you've got to do it again. And then I also really enjoyed giving that water bottle to someone at the start of the race. That meant something to me, because it was my way of giving something of me to the to the crowd. So yes, I literally took those words with me.
And can you describe what it would do for you when you started to read it, or you focused on it?
It reminds me to keep perspective. That poem's really important to me because as an athlete, and as I was increasingly as a winning athlete, there's a lot of expectation around you being on top of the podium at every race. And it taught me that I'm the same person whether or not I win or lose, triumph and disaster, treating them
Both the same.
It taught me to make the most of every moment.
Wow.
And I every line of that poem has something to teach me.
Yeah.
But just going back to the adversity, for me, it's always really important to recollect times in the past where I've overcome things, not just in a sporting context, and how others have too. I remember going into what was my final race, and I read Sir Steve Redgrave's autobiography, and just knowing what he'd achieved, maybe because of, not even despite of, the setbacks he'd had, what he'd achieved because of those setbacks, I think, it empowered me to think that maybe I could do so too. So I think that power of recollection and knowing that we've overcome in the past is really, really important as well.
And how much would you draw on your experiences when you were in Nepal, when you were still working for, was it DEFRA at the time? So you saw like crushing poverty, you saw people with nothing making the best out of life. How much would you go back to your own biography and draw on those kind of things for perspective?
My time in Nepal shaped me as a person and definitely shaped me as an athlete. So I was working as a policy advisor to the government, and another, point of maybe a fork in the road, you could call it. I stepped off the path again and went to live and work in Nepal. So it wasn't part of my job at DEFRA. I took a sabbatical and I went to work for a Nepali organisation working on water and sanitation and health projects. And if I was to summarise what Nepal gave me in one word, it's perspective. Because you realise how much you have relative to others, and how fortunate we are to live the life that we lead. And I saw resilience and tenacity firsthand, and for me that was incredibly inspiring. But on a very personal level, it was really the first time that I challenged myself physically and really created the physical foundations for what would become a professional sporting career. And people often think that I came from nowhere as a sports person, but I think everyone comes from somewhere. And you're shaped by all of these amazing experiences in your life. And some athletes, your Serena Williams, your Tiger Woods, your David Beckhams, take a more conventional, stereotypical path. And I certainly didn't travel that path, but I traveled a path. And I think for me, it enabled me to achieve what I did. So I was very much shaped by my time in Nepal and what I saw and what I worked on. And it also taught me a lot about shaping change and how local people can be should be the agents of change rather than it being imposed from above. So I've carried that kind of belief and understanding and philosophy through to what I do in my career now, and that was a really important learning for me.
I think there's also a lot of really important learnings for people listening to this, and I think one of the big takeaways for me is that I kind of exhaust myself saying to people, just by employing what seem like insignificant tricks, you can make a real difference to your own life trying to achieve high performance. And, we've just spoken about writing a poem on the side of a water bottle. It's not the only reason you became a world champion. Of course it isn't. But it was quite a big part of that journey towards becoming a champion. I just think it's really important for people to listen to this and understand that when you write down something, or when you take inspiration from a trip to Nepal, or putting a poem somewhere, or having something in your house that really resonates with you, I don't think we do it enough as people. I think that we just assume, well, it's just words, it's just a poem. Finding the ability to translate that into something that's inspiring, you are a sort of the epitome of how powerful that can be.
It's been really useful to me in my life, and it's also been really useful to have that why, to have an understanding. It's not enough to have a goal. I think the goal, I guess, to have soul needs to have a why, and I think that why needs to come from within.
Yeah.
And I've always, and that why can change, and it has done for me. But that inner why, I've always tried to have an answer to that, and that's been really useful for me in helping me shape my life and direct my life, and maybe helping me perform
to my
potential.
Chrissie? So when you were competing, what was it, and how has it shifted to today?
My why has always been to see how good I can be, to answer that question of myself, to feel like I've fulfilled a potential. That's quite nebulous, isn't it? Because as soon as you get to that point, where there's more to achieve. But to answer that question of how good can you be at that sport of triathlon, and then, but my life purpose, I think, to drive positive change. So for me, sport was a means to a greater end. It wasn't an end in itself. Sport's a really selfish pursuit, isn't it? It's just all about you and what you want to achieve. But you can make it less selfish, and you can achieve something more by using it to inspire, or to convey messages, and to impact others in a really positive way. So I think those were my two whys. But I retired having answered the first question.
Yeah.
And that was very liberating for me.
And what was the answer you found?
I found it in the final race that I did, and it taught me that I could achieve more than I ever thought possible. And it taught me that my perfect race was when I overcame imperfections perfectly. And so that race was certainly not perfect in the way I was able to prepare, or the way I prepared. And it was certainly not perfect, in quotation marks, in terms of it wasn't without pain and discomfort. But for me, it was my perfect race, because it was the battle within myself that I had craved. It was the battle with my competitors that I'd wanted. And I crossed that finish line. I felt really complete as an athlete. And we're driven by these extrinsic motivations, aren't we? All of us, but athletes especially, by the number of victories, the number of world championships you're going to win, or the world records. But it's all ephemeral, because someone will come along and you would have won 4 and they'll win 5, and you'll go 8 hours 18 and they'll go 8 hours 17. And so it's got, your definition of success has got to come from within, and that sense that you have given something everything.
Yeah.
And that race gave me that gift. And I knew intuitively that it was the time to retire. So I'd maybe answered that question of the why question.
And is that a question that, because I can see some really interesting parallels there from, you said you went on the academic pathway of wanting to excel, and you'd been to university in Birmingham and then Manchester, and then decided to step off that path. Could you see the parallels with that at the end of your triathlon career, that you felt like you got to the end of that journey and wanted to step off?
It's different incarnations of life, isn't it? Yeah. And once you've stepped off the path, you grow in confidence and you grow in self-belief. And it's that power of recollection, because you know if you've done it in the past and it's, you know, it's been an opportunity, that you can do so again. So I wouldn't claim that. I don't really call it retiring, because you're not retired in the sense you're putting your feet up, but transitioning away from professional sport was easy. It certainly wasn't. It was fraught with challenges for me psychologically, but I knew instinctively that it was the right thing to do. And I guess to your point, it didn't scare me, because I knew I'd done it many times. I'd stepped off the path many times in my life, and I knew intuitively that it was the right thing to do. But it's certainly not easy. And you've had many guests on this podcast that have spoken about that. You know, you question who you are and your sense of identity, and you have no structure and no focal point in, you know, anchor for your life. You know, obviously your financial security as a professional athlete is wedded to your income from that sport, and so a lot of things are brought into question. But that's precisely why I needed to do it, because for me, sport was a comfort zone. It was where I was comfortable, not physically comfortable because it hurt, but psychologically quite comfortable. And, you know, I was blessed to have, you know, commercial partners, sponsors that, you know, gave me financial security. I was winning. I had a great team around me. I had that single-minded focus on this goal. But that's very comfortable, isn't it? And so I knew if I was to grow and develop, I knew I needed to step off the path. And it was very uncomfortable for a time.
And how important were the tools you learned about resilience in professional sport in helping you get through that period?
Very, very, very important. Knowing that I can withstand discomfort and pain and being uncomfortable is something that you can carry with you in any walk of life. Sport is a great teacher, isn't it? And it taught me that. It taught me that I could be resilient, but I also gained that resilience from others around me. And it was really important for me to have uplifting, supportive people around me that could help me navigate this, the new life that I had to live. So it wasn't something I kind of worked through independently. But for me, a lot boiled down to, you know, to being comfortable with being uncomfortable, being comfortable with a void. Often we need that clarity of an answer, don't we? Where are you going? What is your goal? Where are you heading? What's your plan? And I didn't know. And I didn't have the answer. And that's quite scary, because I'm quite a structured, regimented person, and I needed to know. And I needed to know, if I wasn't doing sport, what was I going to do? And I had this label. You know, when you go to America and you fill out your form, and what's your occupation? And I went to the States in 2012, and I didn't know what to write. And that was quite disconcerting.
Well, it's the first thing everyone ever asks, isn't it? Oh, nice to meet you. What do you do?
What do you do? Because we're a society that loves a label, and you're defined by that label, and you defined yourself by that label. So if I wasn't Chrissie Wellington 4-time world champion, what was I? Well, the truth of the matter is I was the same person before I was an athlete, when I was an athlete, and afterwards. I was the same person, but I just needed to find a new why.
Oh, so what did you find then when you started to ask these uncomfortable questions then of, I'm no longer an athlete, so why do I exist? What's my purpose?
I think a lot of us go through that, Damien, and a lot, you know, it's hard to find what your passion is. People ask me, how do you find what your passion is? the only answer I have is to explore and to try. And that's what I tried to do. So I tried to be open to possibilities. I knew that I didn't have the answers, so I just had to be open to possibilities. So I had to try and say yes. I had to try and open doors, but walk through doors that were opened for me. I spoke to a lot of people. I tried to learn. I tried to read a lot. And I do believe life is a series of kind of serendipitous encounters. And you do make your own luck to some extent. But it was through, I think, talking to people, being still and being open to opportunities that I was able almost, I guess, to come full circle, because I came back to what that purpose was when I was that 7-year-old girl watching images on the TV of the Ethiopian famine, of wanting to drive positive change. So if my purpose is to ignite a fire, a constructive fire, and drive positive change, then how could I do that? And with this passion for physical activity, I knew I wanted to combine those two things. So how do I drive positive change in the sphere of enabling people to become more active? And that, understanding that, helped guide me and brought me into contact with a number of people. And then I was fortunate to have a door that opened to me to become an employee for Parkrun. So I think it was just going back to looking at what my purpose was.
And I'm so pleased you mentioned the passion thing as well, because I think one of the really common mistakes people make these days is when they think, well, someone recommends I do this, or I feel I should do that, but I'm not sure I'm passionate about it. I'm a firm believer that you have to give it a go and see whether the passion starts to emerge. I think we're stuck in, it's so common, isn't it, in society? Or don't do that unless you're passionate about it. Well, how am I going to know if I'm passionate about it until I start on the journey?
You just try.
Yeah.
Because you'll find joy, talents that you may never known that you had you not been open to that opportunity. So just having a willingness to try is really important. And then being intuitive, to your point about, we're bombarded. We're told, society tells us that we're flawed and that there are products out there that can fix us. But I think if we look deep inside, we know what excites us. And so if we're open to trying new things and then we listen to what that inner voice tells us, I think often we have that answer that we're seeking.
Do you know why I like what you just said? Is because we now get a lot of comments from people saying, I've listened to the High Performance podcast. Your podcast has helped me change my life. It's changed everything for me. And I always have the same emotion when I read those messages, which is that the High Performance podcast hasn't really helped you change your life at all. You've helped you change your life. We were just sort of having conversations that started that. And I think it's really, you're so right. We all feel like the answer has to be given to us from somewhere else in society. But even just listening to a conversation like this, I hope reminds people that it is already there. They just have to kind of somehow switch it on. And sometimes, as you said, the best thing to do is to be still and just see what happens.
And listen to it. And
it takes bravery though, doesn't it? It takes courage.
Matters to you. But I think there's also a fear, Jake, of being wrong, of doing something wrong, of making a mistake. And that fear, especially in our society, is debilitating. Fear of ridicule, fear of what people might think, fear of failure, whatever. Yeah. It's debilitating. But for me, that the biggest failure, to my mind, is not trying. I would berate myself if I didn't give it a go, because then I'd never know.
So interesting. So where did the idea come from, or what was the reason for the children's books? Was it this infinite purpose you have for passing on to the next generation, or do you feel that there are messages that we need to give our young people in a certain way that they can absorb them?
Tom and I have a 5-year-old daughter, and my friend Susie has 2 children, and we wanted to use the books as a way of conveying the messages that we want to impart to our children, the lessons that we've learned from our life journeys that we want to share with our children, and that we hope will resonate with children and adults alike. The aim of the books is to ignite that spark in someone, that spark that you spoke about, to impart really simple suggestions for how people can improve their own health and improve their well-being and gaining confidence and live fuller, richer lives. And the books are very simple. They're based on what nature can teach us. So it's a girl talking to a flower, and a brother and a sister talking to a tree, and it's using nature. It's conveying those messages through the medium of nature. And for us, it was really important that all children and adults could identify with the characters in the book. So they're deliberately drawn in black and white, and they're deliberately drawn so you can't see the faces of the children. Susie's children are mixed race, and she especially felt really strongly that she wanted to create books that were open and accessible to everybody, with I guess we're as inclusive as we could possibly make them. So that's why they're drawn in a really kind of simple, monochrome way.
So Chrissie is the father of 2 young children, and Jake's got 2 young children himself. What kind of questions or suggestions should we be asking our children that could ignite that spark of curiosity?
I think first and foremost we have to role model behaviours. So if we as their parents are open to opportunities, if we can do positive people, then there's a greater chance that our children will try and emulate those behaviours. I try not to set limits on what we think Esme can achieve. Obviously, you've got to manage risk as a parent, but I think sometimes we can be too risk averse. A few weeks ago, myself and my husband, we were in Wales, and we thought it would be a great challenge as a family to try and climb Snowdon. And someone said, well, do you think Esme can do that? She's only 5. And my response was, we need to give her the opportunity to try. Because it's not for me as her parent to decide what she can and can't do, what she is and isn't capable of. We just need to give her the opportunity to try and be willing to, to accept that she might not be able to, and that's okay too. But to determine, a priori that she can't do something is very limiting. So I think just giving your children the opportunity to try things and take managed risks is really important. And yeah, like I said, also leading by example.
How did she go?
It was one of the proudest moments of my life when, we got to the top of Snowdon, bribed by Percy pigs and
Love it.
and chocolate. That was just Tom and me. But it was wonderful because we were apprehensive about her getting tired or whinging and it being incredibly painful and having to drag her up and sitting her on our shoulders. And it wasn't like that at all. So all of those fears that we had about what she might do didn't come to fruition. But if we'd let those fears about what might happen stop us, we never would have done it. So again, a small kind of example, but you've got to be open to that possibility and that opportunity.
And by the way, that's not just people with kids, is it? How often do people write stories in their heads about what's going to happen at the job interview, on their big day, when they go for a doctor's appointment, whatever it might be that's in the future. We always make these stories up, don't we? Rather than actually waiting to see what happens. I think before we go on to the quickfire questions to finish with, I think the only thing I really just want to touch on with you is that people see you and they think, wow, what an incredible life. You know, you traveled, you saw desperate poverty that obviously lit a fire and inspired you. And then you had the wherewithal and the bravery and the confidence and the fearlessness at 30 to decide to get into an elite level sport. And it wasn't just any old elite level sport, it was triathlons, which by and large you can't get psychologically or physically more challenging than that. And then you managed to become the best in the world at what you were doing. That looks really easy. And I think it's probably an important message to tell people that I would imagine this journey has not been necessarily easy and possibly even continues not to be easy. But just because it isn't easy doesn't mean that it isn't good for you.
It's not psychologically easy, and professional sports certainly wasn't physically easy. And I never want to give the impression that it was. It was arduous, hard graft every single day. You know, I dedicated my life to it, and it was challenging for me psychologically in many ways. I had to, you know, grapple with some demons, or what I, you know, try and control a lot of self-criticism and self-doubt, and that was incredibly challenging. So for me, it was a physical test, and it was a psychological test. But that's what made it so incredible. I learned so much from professional sport. It gifted me with so many things, and an understanding of myself, an appreciation for the power of possibility, the gift of relationships with so many people that I came into contact with. So it wasn't an easy journey, and life still isn't an easy journey. It's fraught with difficulties, but life is the difficulty, isn't it? It's the frustration and the challenge, and therein lies the beauty. But I have a perspective that is very positive and really optimistic, and I think that really serves me well in the face of adversity as well.
So can I just ask you a question about the demons that you described there? Like, what form did they take? What was the demon's form of attack on your self-confidence or your esteem?
I'm prone to being very, very self-critical. And I'm sure a lot of people you speak to can talk to this, because it's a double-edged sword. It's what drives you, because you're critical, because you're saying you're never enough, but then you're never enough, which is a really challenging place to be mentally. I credit my first coach with helping me to address some of these. So these I guess I wouldn't say flaws, but they risk derailing me as an athlete, because I was so self-questioning and so self-critical. So his advice to me was very simple: is I give the order, you execute. And he was a very authoritarian character, which again has its pros and cons. But so he gave me the order for the day. I executed the training session to the best of my ability, and that was enough. And just knowing that liberated me, because he took the decision making and the questioning of whether or not I had done a good job, whether or not I'd been enough in that training session or not, away from me. I simply just executed his order. And I think it speaks to focusing on that process and bringing your best self to every moment. And it's not whether you're good or bad. It is. It's your best self in every moment, and that's what it is. And then you move on. And he taught me that, and sport taught me that too.
So when you moved on from that coaching relationship and you moved to other coaches, did those demons come back, or had you put them to bed?
I think he enabled me to be a lot less self-critical and more self-accepting. And so I could carry that lesson through to my next coach. And my next coach was an entirely different character. I went from a very authoritarian coach to being coached by someone who I consider a friend. It was a lot more reciprocal for me, a lot more empowering. And as you evolve as an athlete, what you need from a coach is different. What you need at the outset of your career can be very, very different a few years on. And I transitioned away from one coach to the other, but I certainly carried the lessons that I'd learned from my first coach to my second.
And has that helped today since you've left triathlon behind? How do you deal with that self-doubt, those demons that you just described?
I have wonderful people around me that are enriching and positive, and I think that's really important. I try to live a life of gratitude and be grateful for what I have, and see the cup half full rather than the cup half empty. So I'm prone to, at the end of the day, thinking about what I haven't done, what I haven't managed to do in this busy day of mine, rather than what I have. So it's pivoting. We spoke about pivoting that thought. So instead of focusing on what I haven't done, I think, I have done this, and I have done this, and that's okay. But I think ultimately it's accepting, like with life, that's got its ups and downs and its goods and bads, and I'm like that too. Yeah. I'm not this perfect, infallible human that's not without flaws or self-doubt or neuroses, but that's me. And that's okay.
I also like what you said about just being the best you can be rather than the perfect you. And that accounts for the good days, the bad days, when you're flying, when you're struggling. I think just if you can just finish and go, I did the best I could, man, that is so much more than asking whether you were perfect or not, honestly.
I mean, Susie, my co-author, often says you're never more valuable than you are in this moment. And that's the line, one of the lines in the book. Because it doesn't mean you can't strive to be better, but you're valuable as you are right now. And I'm trying to live my life like that.
Wonderful. Really such a nice way to finish. We always finish, though, with our quickfire questions. The first one is your 3 non-negotiables that you and the people around you have to buy into.
There's non-negotiable behaviours that I have for myself. I've become a lot more accepting of others and differences in others. So I don't think there are non-negotiable behaviours that I would necessarily expect from others, but for myself, an acceptance of and forgiveness of myself and others, humility and respect for myself and respect for other people.
What advice would you give to a teenage Chrissie just starting out?
The advice that my father gave me, and that was seize every opportunity and make a mark on the world for all the right reasons.
Wow. I think we can say you did that, right? Yeah. I think we can say you did that. What would you say is your biggest strength, and what is your greatest weakness?
My greatest weakness is that I'm prone to being quite self-critical. And my biggest strength is my passion and my enthusiasm and my willingness to bring the best of myself to every moment and everything I do.
Would you give us one book recommendation for our listeners that's had a big impact on you?
Can it be a poem?
Definitely.
Rudyard Kipling's If.
And the final question, your your final message, I guess, to people listening and watching this, your one golden rule to living a high performance life?
Bring the best of yourself to every moment, be willing to learn and live a life of integrity.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give us a thumbs up, leave a review, but somehow get involved with the High Performance Podcast and become part of our growing community.